Indignation over the murder of three audiovisual media students in the state of Jalisco was heard loud and clear on the streets of Mexico City.
In March 2018, Guadalajara witnessed a tragedy that exposed the brutal reality of drug trafficking in Mexico. 3 film students became victims of the ruthless machinery of the Jalisco Cartel. New Generation. What began as an innocent project turned into a nightmare of unimaginable proportions because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Javier Salomon Aceves, 25, Daniel Diaz, and Marco Garcia, both 20, shared an overflowing passion for film that had brought them together at the University of Audiovisual Media. Their dreams, as vibrant as the Jalisco sun, were about to be brutally interrupted. Salomon, originally from Mexicali, was the oldest and most experienced. His talent was not limited to the camera. He was also a drummer in a death metal band. Daniel, from Los Chapitos, alternated his love for soccer with making short films. Marco, from Tepic, excelled in editing and post-production. The 3 formed a formidable creative team, complementing each other's skills and nurturing each other's aspirations. On March 19th, the students arrived at a farm in Tonalá to shoot their final project, a short horror film. This farm had a dark history, intertwined with Jalisco's criminal underworld. It had previously belonged to Diego Gabriel Mejia, a capo of the rival Nueva Plaza cartel who was about to be released from prison. Paranoid and territorial, the CJNG kept a constant watch on the property. Any movement was considered a potential threat, but no one could have imagined that this obsessive vigilance would lead to fatal confusion. When the students arrived to film, the CJNG hitmen mistook them for members of the rival cartel, a mistake that would cost 3 innocent lives and expose the relentless cruelty of the world in which they operated. The irony of his choice of gender would soon become painfully obvious. The mood on the set was one of excitement. No one could have imagined that this seemingly ordinary location hid a dark secret related to drug trafficking. As the sun set, the crew decided to wrap up filming and return home. It was this seemingly innocuous decision that would seal their fate. On the way back, their vehicle stopped unexpectedly on the Periférico Nuevo. Suddenly, 2 pickup trucks surrounded them. Armed men, falsely identifying themselves as agents of the prosecutor's office, ordered them to get out. In an instant, the line between the fiction they had been filming and the brutal reality blurred. The assassins separated the 3 young men from their companions. No one knew at the time that these men belonged to the feared Jalisco Cartel, New Generation, CJNG. As Salomon, Daniel, and Marco were forced into the vans, their companions were left behind. The clock struck 8:09 p.m. when the young men were intercepted on the Periférico Nuevo. Their companions, helpless witnesses to the kidnapping, were paralyzed with fear. Confusion and panic took hold of them. Etna Judith, Solomon's aunt and owner of the house where the students had filmed their project, received the news of the kidnapping. Her initial reaction was one of shock, followed by a series of questionable decisions. Instead of immediately contacting the authorities, she opted to move the students' vehicles, possibly to avoid suspicion. The hours passed, and the silence grew heavier. Why was Etna Judith taking so long to report the disappearance? What did she know about the hidden history of her property? It was not until 1 a.m. on March 20th, almost 5 hours after the abduction, that the official report was made. This delay would raise serious suspicions in the following days. Meanwhile, Guadalajara slept, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding. But dawn brought with it a wave of anguish and concern. Social networks were flooded with photos of the 3 missing youths. The news spread like fire in the dry prairie. The city awoke from its lethargy. Thousands of students, shocked by the disappearance of their classmates, took to the streets. Their voices were united in a cry that resounded throughout the city. Alive they took them, alive we want them. Public pressure grew quickly, attracting the attention of prominent figures. Guillermo del Toro, the celebrated Guadalajara-born director, used his global influence to demand answers. His voice amplified the message, putting Jalisco in the international spotlight. But while society was mobilized, the authorities seemed to be taking blind steps. The first searches yielded no results. False leads led to dead ends. Frustration grew among families and investigators alike. Etna Judith was arrested weeks later. Authorities charged her with human trafficking, alleging that she owned several businesses that served as fronts for illicit activities. This arrest raised more questions than answers. Was Solomon's family somehow involved in his disappearance? Or was this a distraction from the real investigation? The pressure reached the highest levels of the state government. The governor of Jalisco, feeling the weight of public opinion, gave the prosecutor an ultimatum: 15 days to solve the case. The clock started ticking. But would it be enough time to unravel a mystery that seemed more complex with each revelation? As the hours passed, the hope of finding Solomon, Daniel, and Marco alive faded. The 3 students suddenly found themselves in the heart of drug trafficking hell. In a safe house in the Pinar de Tonala neighborhood, a brutal interrogation began. The CJNG hitmen, convinced that the youths were members of the rival cartel, unleashed their fury. Salomon, the eldest of the group, was the first to suffer. They beat him mercilessly, demanding information he did not have. His cries of pain and protestations of innocence fell on deaf ears. Daniel and Marco, terrified, witnessed helplessly the torture of their friend. Hope of survival faded with each blow Solomon received. But the horror was just beginning. Solomon, unable to resist any longer, succumbed to his wounds. His death, far from satisfying his captors, only intensified their thirst for blood. Daniel and Marco, realizing that there was no way out, faced their fate with a silent bravery that we will never know. With chilling efficiency, the CJNG moved on to the next phase of their macabre plan. The bodies of the 3 young men were moved to another house in the Prados de Coyula neighborhood. There, in a backyard converted into a laboratory of death, they began the process of erasing all evidence. In this dark panorama, a disconcerting figure emerges: Christian Omar Palma Gutierrez, known in the rap world as QBA. With more than 200 million followers on YouTube, his songs spoke of violence, drugs, and life in organized crime. But what seemed to be just music would turn out to be a horrible reality. QBA was recruited by the CJNG not for his musical talent, but for his willingness to perform one of the narcos' most macabre tasks, that of pozolero, the one in charge of disappearing bodies by dissolving them in acid. This rapper turned pozolero went into action. With a coldness that contrasted with his image as an artist, he directed the process of dissolving the bodies. 46 drums of sulfuric acid were waiting, mute witnesses of a heinous crime. QBA's confession about his involvement in the disappearance of the film students shook Mexico, not only because of the act itself, but because of what it represented: the slender, line between pop culture apology for crime and actual participation in acts of such magnitude. Meanwhile, Guadalajara was boiling. Families, friends, the entire society demanded answers. The pressure on the authorities was immense. Finally, on April 23rd, more than a month after the disappearance, the Jalisco prosecutor's office called a press conference. The prosecutor confirmed that the students had been murdered and their bodies dissolved in acid. The news fell like a bombshell, not only in Mexico, but around the world. The international media echoed the tragedy, exposing the brutal reality of drug trafficking in Mexico. The reactions were immediate and visceral. The families, devastated, faced the cruel truth. Mexican society, horrified, wondered how it was possible for something like this to happen. How could three innocent young people, full of dreams and talent, end up like this? The case of Salomon, Daniel, and Marco became a symbol of the rampant violence sweeping Mexico. But it also raised uncomfortable questions. How many others had suffered the same fate? How many families are still searching for their loved ones, unaware that there is nothing left to find? The official confirmation of the students' fate closed one chapter, but opened many more. The case of the three film students shook Mexico to its foundations. The brutal truth of their deaths demanded justice, and authorities were forced to act under intense public pressure. In a series of spectacular operations, Jalisco police, supported by federal forces, began to close in on those responsible. The first blow came with the capture of Christian Omar Palma Gutierrez, LQBA. His arrest opened a window into a dark world where pop culture and organized crime were sinisterly intertwined. But QBA was just the tip of the iceberg. In quick succession, Eduardo Giovanni Gomez Reynoso, El Cochi, Jonathan Alejandro Anaya Delgadillo, Kalimba, Miguel Angel Casillas Perez, Tuntun, and Jonathan Josue Hernandez Moreno, Choco, were killed. 5 members of the CJNG, now facing justice for the heinous crime. The trial that followed captured national attention. The evidence presented painted a chilling picture of brutality and coldness. After weeks of harrowing testimony and forensic evidence, the verdict came: 75 years in prison for each of the defendants. For many, the sentence seemed to mark the end of a nightmare. But for the families of Solomon, Daniel, and Marco, something didn't add up. Had justice really been served? Were these 5 men the only ones responsible for such an elaborate crime? Doubts began to arise. Inconsistencies in the investigation, leads not followed, contradictory testimonies. Families, supported by activists and journalists, began to question the official narrative. The families, supported by activists and journalists, began to question the official narrative. What role did Etna Judith, Solomon's aunt, really play? Why was the house where the students filmed under CJNG surveillance? The pressure grew until the Attorney General's office was forced to reopen the case. This decision, while welcomed by those seeking the truth, also brought with it a disturbing reality: the possibility that the accused could go free due to errors in the original process. As the case took another unexpected turn, Mexico faced the harsh reality of the human cost of drug trafficking. The statistics were overwhelming: more than 200,000 homicides in the last decade, 34,000 people missing. Behind each number, a story of pain, a family torn apart. The trauma lingered not only in the families of Salomon, Daniel, and Marco, but in an entire generation of young people. Guadalajara's student and artistic community, once vibrant and optimistic, now bore the burden of loss and fear. How many more will have to suffer before something changes? The tragedy of these three students has become a symbol of the struggle against impunity and violence in Mexico. Their story continues to resonate, reminding us of the urgency of addressing the roots of drug trafficking and corruption, and the need for a united society to confront these challenges.